So, today we heard about four really fantastic initiatives and several others that Deepa also mentioned. And we've at Light for the World have really realized through our years of work and with several other inclusive education experts that often investing in the early years is so much neglected, even though it can yield the best results and outcomes. For example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, about 70%, there's been a 70% increase in developmental disabilities. Yet the work in early childhood development is still lagging behind. And basically children who are with developmental disabilities or disabilities are neglected, particularly in the early years. We've noticed that in our programs working on community-based rehabilitation, we are finding children far too late past that critical period of development that Tom mentioned earlier. So we decided to look into this and do something about it. And this was the inspiration behind our work on Leave No Child Behind, Invest in the Early Years. We decided that it's really important to raise awareness about the importance of inclusive early childhood development and early childhood education. So I'm really pleased that USAID is taking this initiative to learn more about it. Because inclusive early childhood education is really the bedrock for inclusive education, and it sets up children with disabilities for success in inclusive education. Next slide. In these four, next slide, please. In these four presentations that we saw, I think it's really important to highlight some of the key takeaways from that. Sorry, the previous slide. I thought that, and this will also remind us of what are some of the key things to invest in and work on when we develop inclusive early childhood education programs. We saw that lots of the programs had a very holistic approach under the principles of nurturing care, and that means working with parents and different sectors to be able to ensure that children's full development is addressed. And then we think there's also the Baby Go program, Learning Roots program show that emphasize the importance of parents as being the first teachers of the child. And I really thought that it was very good for us to also be reminded that often we need to make sure that there is proper intervention guidance around how to really implement inclusive early childhood education. This is a relatively new area, and so people need to know what are their roles, what everyone needs to know what their roles are and why it's important, and in this way we can make sure that everybody's on board to deliver and support the child in a holistic manner. As the takeaway, I thought it was really important to note in the e-network was how it's so important to look at age-appropriate play-based learning and not schoolification. I think there's often in programs that I've observed traveling to Ethiopia and others, there's been an overemphasis on teaching children to read and write earlier, opposed to giving them that strong foundation for success that they need to be able to learn and fully comprehend numeracy and literacy. And I think a lot of education still needs to happen around this, and we need to invest in the future, is to make parents and the community understand the importance of play-based learning, because there's a misunderstanding that plays are just a waste of time, and parents seem to prefer the whole learning ABC and to read and write earlier than play-based learning. So I think these are something that I thought is really important to take up in the future. Fourth was in the e-network, we also saw the value of using low cost or no cost material that simulate real life, because it's more meaningful for children, it's more engaging, and it helps them to have a more multi-sensory experience, and it's more accessible. So I think that often there's this misunderstanding that you need produced play material, and we know that these don't last very long. I went to last year I visited some programs in India, which were lovely, but all the toys were broken, and the teacher didn't know how to make other toys, and she was waiting on someone to provide her with new toys. And I thought, what a waste opportunity, because there's so many things, leaves, twigs, fruit, things in the environment that could be used. And we all know how our children love to play with pots and pans when they're babies, opposed to some of the toys that we purchase them. The last important takeaway I thought was important for us to remember is to have child-centered support, and that means nurturing relationships and coaching parents and practitioners on how to support a child's learning development. And I thought the lovely example from Ohamba about not forgetting that children and their peers are also relationships that we need to nurture and help them understand what disability is. I think that was really lovely. So I just wanted to round up and mention some of the key takeaways first before I move on to our work in investing in inclusive education, inclusive early childhood development. So as I mentioned earlier, we did, next slide, we did a research to look into inclusive early childhood development, and we want to look at some of the investment levels in this area. A lot of the practices you saw today, they are simple and can yield great results, but often there are not enough programs on inclusive early child development, and there's still little understanding of its added value. So we wanted to change that situation. And we looked into the funding levels of some of the major donors to education and ECD, and the findings we found were not surprising, but still shocking. Despite knowing the great impact that early child development has on improving learning outcomes, it's still massively underfunded, and there are lots of verbal commitments about it, but when it comes to actual financial commitments, those are quite low. The second key finding that we had was that vulnerable children, especially those who are at risk of developmental delays and disabilities or have disabilities, are often not included in these programs. And that's quite sad, considering that they have the potential to actually gain the most from inclusive early childhood development programs or early childhood education programs. The last finding which we found was that investment levels for this areas was nowhere near what is required for providing integrated inclusive ECD, which that would ensure that all children don't just survive but thrive. And I think that the idea of people not knowing how to do it, I mean, that is slowly being dispelled, because we have now seen some great examples, and more examples of good practices are being created in various countries and contexts that we can learn on and take to scale. Last slide. When we looked at, I'm taking the opportunity, since I have lots of USAID people here. We also looked at USAID and its role, and one of the things that we could see that USAID is doing, has the potential to advance this area quite significantly, because the commitments made in the Children in Adversity policy is very reassuring, and I think that we are hoping that to see that inclusive ECD is taken up more meaningfully year on out, because I think USAID could be a massive game changer in the sector. We also, one of the things that we thought would be really useful for USAID to do is to scale up early childcare education funding and to the 10% recommended by the education community. Because at the moment, when we looked at, even though this might not be a very realistic, a true reflection of the work or investment in early child education, in 2017, according to the OECD DAC database, USAID had not made much of an investment in pre-primary education. But I know that this also partly due to how data on financing is logged onto the OECD database. We also thought that one of the things that we hope could move forward is that USAID, having done the how to note on disability, etc. It would be important moving forward to make sure that other education actors or funding to pre-primary or funder or grantees that are working on pre-primary education are made aware of this wonderful resource and are encouraged to make disability inclusion, to do disability inclusion in their programming. So these are just some of the recommendations that we had in our work on financing and investing more in inclusive ECD. And I'm hoping here that people from the countries that are working in USAID, country office and regional office, will carry the message forward about the importance of inclusive early childhood education and early child development, because it's such an important area of where investment is so needed, and it can make a massive change and transform the lives of children with disabilities. Thank you, Tom. Just the last, sorry, I just forgot to mention, lastly, we are launching the report on the 19th of November, just ahead of Universal Children's Day. And we also have a campaign going on with Global Citizen and others. And we are hoping that with the support of USAID, we can also influence the Global Partnership for Education as they are developing their funding strategy, because we need to get everybody on board and to make sure that we amplify the importance of investing in inclusive early child education. Thank you.
Thank you, Nafisa.